On the one hand, Narendra Modi set lofty climate goals at the COP26 climate conference in the fall of 2021, including achieving net zero emissions by 2070. But on the other, his government has watered down India's environmental rules, used protected lands for industrial purposes, and cracked down on environmentalists. 23-year-old Disha Ravi is a symbol of that. As a climate activist in 2019, she launched the Indian wing of Fridays for the Future, the movement inspired, of course, by Greta Thunberg. She was also arrested and detained for 10 days in 2021 for sedition and conspiracy over a document connected to India's farmer protests, charges that she denies. She now joins us for Perspective. Disha, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Can you start by telling our viewers what inspired you to start your activism back in 2018, if I'm correct?
Yes. So my grandparents are farmers who've had to suffer through the water crisis quite a bit when I was really young. And this was because of their dependency on underground water levels, which was depleting. And it took me a while to realize that this was caused by the climate crisis because it's very normalized here. And that's when I started working towards climate justice.
The IPCC climate report had a dire assessment for India in particular, saying that the repercussions there will be irreversible if major changes aren't made. How do you see climate change affecting your daily life in India?
So currently we are experiencing heat waves in India. My city hasn't been hit, luckily, but the weather and the temperatures are already rising. We've been experiencing 32, 34 degrees in my city. Up north, it's much worse, where it's closing 40, almost 50 in some regions. And that is very concerning because these aren't temperatures that people can sustain and live their lives in. And it's closed. And if you're a manual laborer or a worker who has to work out in the sun, it could lead to deaths, and it has been happening across the country, and that is very concerning. So we're already experiencing the climate crisis.
Now, I understand that you can't talk about your case because of bail conditions, but can you speak to some of the dangers that Indian climate activists face and maybe some of the legislative tools that Narendra Modi's government has used to justify the crackdown?
A lot of laws that in the criminal justice space have been used to detain and arrest activists across the space. And right now there are protests going on in Hasteo against coal mining by indigenous people. And there has been a crackdown on them, and they have been detained and arrested, and there have been trees cut in the middle of night when women have been protesting on the front line. So it is a very concerning period because they've used specific laws that don't even require a lot of the police to cross a lot of red tape before they arrest someone. And that is very concerning because these specific laws are being used to arrest activists, and indigenous people in India who've been protesting have been facing the worst of it.
So given that, what do you make of Narendra Modi's promises to increase non-fossil energy capacities, to reduce carbon emissions, even net zero by 2070? Even if this were to happen, do you think it's feasible, and do you think it's enough?
I do believe that India has a role to play in reducing our emissions, but I also believe that the global north has a bigger role than we do because we don't have historic emissions the same way that the US or Europe does. So I think the promises we made at COP26 was definitely ambitious, and I hope we invest enough resources to achieving them. But I would like to see a just transition plan in place to move away from fossil fuels, which is something that we don't currently have, and our dependency on coal is still very high. And I hope this is something we work on.
Now, you mentioned a distinction between the global south and the global north there. It reminds me of this distinction that's been made between global south environmentalism and whitewashed environmentalism, things like recycling and waste initiatives. Why is this version not convincing to you?
To be very honest, I started off at recycling and doing all the individual actions. But I think when we focus on individual actions, we take away from holding systems accountable. And that is something that we haven't been able to balance because sometimes while we can do all the individual actions we want, like we can segregate recycling, but sometimes at the end of the day we find out the waste was being mixed at all, in the end result. So it's important to hold corporations accountable, because fossil fuel industries have been responsible for the climate crisis, and to shift that blame on individuals is like very unfair. And they often make us check our emissions when in reality we don't own any oil mines or oil fields, and we didn't set the ocean on fire. So I think it's important for us to be holding them accountable while also playing our part individually.
And similarly, you've spoken before about how you feel that these COP climate conferences have excluded countries of the global south. Can you expand upon that?
I feel like in COP26, activists have always had, from the global south especially, have always been silenced, both by the media and by policymakers there. And all the focus is excessively on the future while we are experiencing the climate crisis today. They make all these promises about what they're going to do later, while in reality, the policies they have today are very much the opposite of what they want to achieve. We've been cut out of interviews, we've been cut out of press conferences, and we've had to beg for the table every single time. And even then, no one really listens to us. And the focus has always been on the future. And we had to experience greenwashing and gaslighting by world leaders. And this is something that is very exclusive to people from the global south and people of color from the global north.
Disha Ravi, that's all we have time for, unfortunately, today. But thank you so much for your time, for coming on Perspective today.
Thank you so much for having me.